Thank you for that introduction, Ron. It's a real honor to be part of this panel, and I'll be talking today about gradients in child development for the 90% of children who live in lower and middle income countries, the 90% of the world's children who live in lower and middle income countries. I'll present data about what we know can be effective in terms of interventions to improve conditions for these children. So you've heard today that the negative effects of growing up in poverty extend from infancy through adolescence and into adulthood. And children living in poverty can suffer from poor health, cognitive and socio-emotional delays, and behavior problems. And we've also heard that the foundations of brain architecture are laid down early in life through dynamic interactions of genetic, biological, and psychosocial influences. These processes affect the timing and pattern of genetic expression and can shape brain structure and function. And early exposure to these risks really set children on a lower developmental path. Now, children in the US, Canada, or other developed countries are exposed to a range of risk factors that are well known: poor housing, dangerous neighborhoods, household crowding, pollution, stress, and less stimulating learning environments. But in developing countries, children live in conditions of even greater financial deprivation, and conditions are exacerbated by several other kinds of conditions: lack of sanitation facilities, lack of fresh water, larger family size, higher levels of maternal depression, lack of access to schools and health centers, less nutritious foods, and exposure to infectious diseases, toxic metals, malaria, and HIV/AIDS. These risks associated with poverty affect brain development and can result in dysregulation of the stress system and can change electrical activity of the brain relating to efficiency of cognitive processing. And in fact, as a consequence of these risk factors, an estimated 220 million children, 0 to 5, worldwide, this is 40% of all children living in lower and middle income countries, show evidence of delayed development. And there are hundreds of millions of children more than this, older children, adolescents, and adults who are older than 5 who have experienced this kind of delay. Now, these are the children who have survived. These are the ones who are living a life of disadvantage because they're impoverished. This is over and above the 10 million children who die each year from malnutrition or diarrhea or other conditions. So I'll be talking today about gradients for these in this population and also interventions that target children in lower and middle income countries. Now, this figure here is from our recent series. This was with Chuck Nelson and several other authors on early child development published in The Lancet, and it summarizes how risk and protective factors encountered before age 5 compromise children's development. So the green line represents a scenario in which protective factors, and in this case that would be breastfeeding or maternal education, outweigh risk factors. And the red line represents a scenario where risk factors are outweighing the protective factors. Now, the blue line is a trajectory of hope of a child. This child has experienced a reduction in risk factors, has experienced an increase in protective factors, or has experienced an intervention during a sensitive period. Now, you can see in the figure that the greater the exposure to cumulative risks, the greater the inequality. And it suggests that early interventions that prevent this inequality are more effective than later interventions that are trying to remedy cumulative deficits. This graph is showing you a really stylized representation of deficits for children living in poverty, but it doesn't show you that there are some developmental systems that appear to be more vulnerable to the negative effects of poverty. There are a handful of studies in the US, for example, showing that regions of the brain are not uniformly affected by SES, and certain neurocognitive systems show greater vulnerability to the negative consequences of living in a household with low SES, particularly on scales of language and executive function. So I was interested to see if these same gradients existed in developing countries and if these same vulnerabilities were in place for the areas of executive function and language. So I'll show you now data from 1,300 children from a nationally representative sample of 3 to 6-year-old children from 150 communities in urban and rural Madagascar, a very low-income African country with an annual gross national product per capita of $340. So this is less than $1 a day. We assessed the children on 7 culturally adapted tests specifically selected to focus on these domains related to poverty or nutrition and intervention, so looking specifically at executive function or language. Now, with almost 70% of the population in Madagascar living below the internationally defined poverty line, you might assume that child outcomes in this context would be uniformly low. But you can see from the figure, using the y-axis on the left-hand side, that there is a significantly positive stepwise increment in mean age-adjusted test score associated with each increasing wealth category. And this is true for receptive language, working memory, which is a measure of executive function, memory of phrases, visuospatial processing, and sustained attention tasks. And this is while controlling for maternal education and other sociodemographic characteristics. Now, the diamond shape here with the axis on the y-axis on the right-hand side shows you the magnitude of the coefficient. So this has to do with the difference in mean scores between the first and fifth quintile. And this difference was greatest for receptive language, working memory, and memory of phrases. Again, measures of language and executive function. There was also a significant interaction effect with age, which was characterized by a divergence in test scores between higher and lower education with increasing age. So you can see that this 4-point difference at the age of 3 becomes a 17-point difference between low and high educated mothers and children of those mothers by the age of 6. Now, studies using neuroimaging techniques have documented that cortical regions that require more cognitive control, such as selective attention tasks, and regions that require responding to complex environmental stimuli, such as language, are those whose activity increase with age, which could explain our findings. So in sum, these results from Madagascar suggest that even in the context of extreme poverty, there are differences in the performance of 3 to 6-year-old children across a range of measures. These differences get bigger over time, and they seem to be more sensitive, they seem to be bigger in the more sensitive areas of language and executive function. Well, you might ask, what about what's happening with kids who are younger than 3? Is this something that's starting at age 3, or when does this begin? When does this gradient emerge? So building on the work in Madagascar and exploring this question of the timing of the gradient, and with even younger children, I've now collected child development data on 9,000 children under age 2 in 4 developing countries: India, Indonesia, Peru, and Senegal. And I'm just showing you data from India, and you can see here there are similar trajectories. If you're looking here, this example from India, seeing the emergence of the SES gradient before 12 months of age. So this is a test of development, ages and stages questionnaire, which includes cognitive, motor, and language components. And you can see that this emergence of the gradient by 8 months. So, and you can see also similar trajectories when you look in the other countries. This is India, but we saw similar trajectories in Indonesia, Peru, and Senegal, suggesting these very consistent patterns across different cultural contexts, and a consistent pattern starting so young, as young as 8 months. So a critical question that emerges is, what is the cause for this gradient? We know that a root cause is poverty, and we know that there are a lot of intermediate behaviors and that can link poverty to these cognitive outcomes in children. So one explanation has to do with parental involvement. What you see here, and this again is from the Lancet series, is a summary of data from 38 lower and middle income countries looking at maternal and paternal activities with their children in the last 3 days. So the activities could be reading a book, taking a walk, going to the park, going to visit a friend. Now, I take away from this 2 key findings. The first, there's a clear socioeconomic gradient. You can see here that mothers in the richest quintile, which is the green, compared with any of the other quintiles, are spending more time engaged in activities with their children. But regardless of quintile, the second major takeaway for me is that the amount of parent-child interaction is still really low, even in the highest quintiles. So you see that even in the maximum, that this is 4 activities over the last 3 days. This is reading a book 4 times, or taking your child out 4 times, or doing a puzzle or some other kind of activity. So these findings on parental activity and the data on the early emergence of gradients clearly point to the need for interventions for children as early as possible in their developmental trajectories. So I'll now talk about this recent systematic review of interventions specifically targeting children 0 to 6 years old in developing countries. And the focus of the review is really on scaled-up versions of programs. So focusing more on effectiveness trials rather than efficacy trials, because the effectiveness ones are the more real-world models. And we included field trials and program evaluations of parenting support and education, pre-primary and preschool centers, conditional cash transfer programs, educational media, and integrated interventions. I'm just going to talk today about the parenting and preschool because they have been the most studied, but most of my own work has focused on looking at the effects of cash transfer programs on child development, because I'm really interested in looking at poverty as the root cause. So we'll talk first about parenting and then about preschool programs. So how do parenting programs and parenting interventions work? They use home home visits, primary health care visits, group sessions, or a combination of group sessions and home visits and community activities. The goal of the interventions is to really increase this number of interactions that adults would have with the child. We found significant positive effects of all the studies we looked at in all 15 studies reviewed. So these parenting interventions were found, and these again were parenting interventions in lower and middle income countries, to increase responsive parent-child interactions, increase attachment, encourage learning and book reading, promote play activities, and encourage positive discipline and better problem solving related to child development. The effects, we calculated effect sizes, and the effect sizes were largest for interventions that included both parent and child rather than for parent-only programs. So it's not enough to give parents information about how to be a better parent or what to do with the child. It is necessary to have the parent and the child together practicing and implementing what the instructor, what the community health worker is encouraging the parent to do. In some cases, effects were greater for younger compared with older children, as we would have hypothesized based on the trajectories, and the effects were greater for poorer children compared with richer children. So the most effective programs, again, were those with systematic training methods, a structured evidence-based curriculum, and opportunities for parental practice and feedback with children. When we looked at preschool interventions, these are any formal or informal instruction just directed at children 3 to 6 years old, in contrast to the parenting programs, which are targeted at 0 to 2-year-olds. Preschool, 8 of the 9 studies in the review comparing preschool attendees in any type of preschool had higher measures of child development. Again, this would have been higher scores on literacy, vocabulary, mathematics, quantitative reasoning, behavior. And similar to the parenting intervention studies, these preschool studies showed increased effects for higher risk and more disadvantaged children. And there were larger effects for higher quality programs with more teacher training, better materials, and greater direct interaction with children. The studies really showed, again, that it's similar, that it's not enough to just give parents information. It's not enough to have a room with a teacher, because that room could fit 50 or 60 kids. The teacher could have no materials and not have any way of engaging the children appropriately in terms of achieving the cognitive and language goals. We found effective innovations in preschool, high-quality pre-reading programs in Costa Rica and Bangladesh, a teacher training program in Jamaica. There are great examples of child-centered methods used in Kenya, and an interactive radio and audio instruction to guide classes for teachers in Zanzibar. So preschool is just one component of a comprehensive early child development agenda. But in an analysis that I'll describe, we use it as a proxy for the potential economic benefits of increasing investment in early childhood. So this is asking the question, if we could get everybody in lower and middle income countries up to the same level of enrollment, so up to 25% preschool enrollment or up to 50% enrollment, what kind of economic return would we get? So we use data from 73 low income and middle income countries with a total population of 3 billion people, and calculated a benefit to cost ratio ranging from 6.4 to 17.6. So this depends on, are you modeling putting everybody in 25% of kids in preschool or to 50%, and then what discount rate you use. So this means for every dollar invested in preschool, you're getting a $6 to $17 return on later school attainment and later labor market participation. And this is really a conservative estimate because it's only calculating the returns on one type of intervention that starts at age 3. And the benefits could be expanded to include, for example, lack of incarceration or other kinds of outcomes that could benefit. So I'm going to conclude with 3 challenges to interventions in early child development, and that I hope will spark a conversation and discussion. So the first key challenge I would identify for early child interventions is to really think about how to reorient the classic thinking about development in developing countries, which has its focus on height, weight, morbidity, and really to expand to all domains of development, such as cognition, language, behavior, socio-emotional development. Because we know, for example, that executive functions such as creativity, flexibility, self-control, discipline are critically important for school readiness and academic success. So this challenge is really saying, let's shift from a model where we talk about a child surviving, and let's talk about a child thriving. Let's talk about a child having a reason to survive and having more prospects for the future. So that's the first challenge. The second, I would say, is that we know that parenting programs and preschool programs can be effective interventions. We also know that conditional cash transfers can be effective programs. But the challenge for this challenge has to do with going beyond traditional teaching and didactic methods of instruction and incorporate what we know about the vulnerability of language and executive function. So we know that children with worse self-control have less persistence, more impulsivity, poorer attention regulation, and worse long-term outcomes. But existing child development programs could be enhanced with a greater focus on child development and responsive interactions with parents or caregivers. This third challenge relates to scaling up to reach the most vulnerable children. We have shown that the most vulnerable children are the ones who respond best to early interventions, but they're also the hardest to reach, and scaling up is not an easy task. We have known, for example, for over 50 years that iodine deficiency causes goiter, cretinism, the loss of IQ, and still we haven't been able to figure out how to get iodized salt to scale so that everybody has access to iodine. We have known for 30 years that hand washing and sanitation are key interventions to promote child health, and yet 30,000 children die each day because they are dying from malnutrition and diarrhea. So these interventions seem simple. These interventions, iodine, hand washing, vitamin A, they seem simple in contrast to providing a high-quality parenting or preschool intervention. But early child development interventions have the potential for improving development for millions of children worldwide who aren't achieving their potential. And through high-quality interventions in early child development, we have the opportunity to break the cycle of inequality that has dominated the lives of millions of children and families in low and middle-income countries where 90% of the world's children reside. Thank you.